Glad to have you back on another edition of Distant Replay Podcast. This is a minisode, a shortened version of what we usually do. We go back to events in the history of sports, big moments, big occasions. And now we're going to mix it up a little bit and add a little bit of true crime to the conversation and what we do week in, week out. And we wanted to start with a football player that you probably heard a lot about, or at least very familiar with, but now more than 20 years removed. He's a guy that the name's there, but maybe the details aren't all there for everybody that is aware of him or thinking about him. So tonight we're going to go through Rae Carruth, who he is, what happened that ended up getting him into jail and being one of the bigger football crime scandals that we've ever seen, up there with O.J. Simpson, honestly. And we're going to go through the trial and just kind of give you some details so you're aware of what happened, just kind of go back through that whole process. So, Mike, when you were thinking about this one, what made you latch on to Rae Carruth as kind of a good starting point for some true crime on this podcast?
For a lot of the same reasons you just mentioned, Ben, is I think everyone knows the name Rae Carruth. It's kind of a very identifiable name, a unique name, but people may not be aware of why they know him or the specifics of what got him into trouble, like you mentioned.
Perfect. So last year, 2019, was the 20th anniversary when this happened. So we're right about 20 years, 21 years now, coming up on the anniversary again. So thought we'd talk about this. So let's start off with who Rae Carruth is, because we've heard about him. We know he's good at football, but before he got into trouble, he was a star on the field.
He sure was. So going way back, we have Rae Carruth was born Ray Lamar Wiggins. Carruth is the last name that he got from his stepfather. So the name Rae Carruth is what he's known as most identifiably today. He grew up in Sacramento, one of these guys that was an all-world high school football player, goes to Colorado. So back then, the University of Colorado Buffaloes, those of you familiar with college football, you'll remember these Colorado teams. They're the ones that featured Cordell Stewart, Michael Westbrook, probably the last heyday, if you will, of Colorado football, right? He's a big first team, all Big 12 at Colorado. That's the level of player we're talking about here. And he entered the 1997 draft as one of these really, really quality prospects, okay? Remember, the Panthers at this time, the Carolina Panthers, are a newer team. They actually had surprisingly reached the NFC Championship game early in their existence, if you remember. Ben, do you remember that?
Yeah, Burline, right?
Yeah, very correct. Very early in their existence. So they had the 27th pick in the first round of the 97 draft. They spent that pick on Rae Carruth. Rae Carruth comes into the league, signs a $3.7 million contract with the Panthers, has an excellent rookie year, is hurt a lot his second year, and now his third year, right in the middle of his third year, is when the incident happens.
Okay. And he wasn't even having a great year at that point. I think it was still a little bit coming back from injury, still a little bit slower start. I think he had 18 catches maybe through that point in the season. So, we're midway point of the season at 18 catches. So he started strong, a bit, dealing with some issues on the field at this point. But he comes in contact with a lady named Cherica Adams, and that's the focus of this crime. So tell us a little bit about Cherica.
So Cherica Adams met Rae Carruth at a party, just typical, two young kids having fun, meet at a party. I think it was one of those relationships, from what I was able to read and research, where maybe Cherica was more interested in having sort of a long-term exclusive relationship with Rae than maybe Rae was with her. Did you get that feeling from what you read?
Yeah, I think she kind of envisioned starting a family. I think it's kind of what she had in mind. Now, whether or not, they had talked about it or whatever else, who knows? But I think that's kind of it seemed like what she had envisioned.
Correct. Yeah, that's exactly the same kind of feeling I got from researching it. So throughout their relationship, Cherica ends up pregnant with Rae's child. And to put it mildly, Rae is not at the point in his life where he wants to be a father. He doesn't want to be tied down. He already has some history with other girlfriends of his getting pregnant.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a big background on this whole story is, he had a girlfriend in college that got pregnant, had his first child. Then he had an ex-girlfriend that I think moved with him to North Carolina when he got drafted, who got pregnant, his child again, but from all accounts, and I think there was testimony during the trial, he forced her to have an abortion because he did not want to pay for another child, essentially. That was kind of his big hang up. He was already paying this child support for the first child, didn't want to have to pay for a second child, and now here comes a third child.
Exactly. And the key thing to remember is what Ben just said. is that he's not very happy with having to pay the child support for his first kid that he doesn't see. Okay. He's vocalized that to multiple people in his life. So that sort of sets the scene for November 16th, 1999, right? Rae and Cherica, who is now pregnant, as we mentioned before, Rae and Cherica go to the movies to see the movie The Bone Collector. Okay. After the movie, it's a situation where Cherica is following Rae home. So they have separate cars. Cherica is following Rae home. Rae slows down in front of Cherica. Another car pulls alongside her and begins shooting. Okay. And how do we know that this is how things unfolded? We know it because right after she was shot, Cherica somehow, showing so much strength, called 911 and described the incident that happened, that her boyfriend, Rae Carruth, stopped in front of her, and she basically vocalized to the 911 dispatcher that she felt that Rae had something to do with what happened to her. Now, she's still alert in the ambulance and still telling the officer who was first on the scene, who jumped in the ambulance with her, that she felt Rae was responsible. I can't stress enough. I read a lot of this true crime stuff and a lot of the podcasts. It's very rare to have a victim this alert after what happened to her and be so clear and descriptive as far as what happened to her.
Yeah, that 911 call's out there on the internet. You can find it. It was part of the trial, obviously. And yeah, you can hear her voice. I mean, it's pretty amazing how calm she was in that moment and how clear she spoke about what had happened. And, they asked her, where is Rae Carruth now? And she said, he just left. He drove off after this happens, which is just, it's such an awful thing to think about. And you hear this, but did you know, Mike, that the cell phone that she was able to call on, and look, this is 1999. So many cell phones were still, they're still pretty new. Not everybody had cell phones though, at this point, but the cell phone she got, Rae Carruth actually had gotten her as a present.
Wow. I didn't read that. Yeah. That's wow.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Huh?
I hadn't read that.
Yeah, so that all happens and unfolds. So essentially what happens after this, Mike, right? So she goes to the hospital. As you mentioned, she's still talking to investigators and still talking about what had happened. She's obviously pregnant. She's 8 months pregnant. So she goes into the hospital. They have to give her a cesarean section right away to try to save the child. But obviously there was a lot of damage done already, a lack of oxygen, caused some brain damage, and they were able to pull Chancellor Lee Adams, is the baby's name. We're able to get him and save him and have him. But she was still there and still talking with investigators for a little time until eventually she went into a coma. But I think investigators I think they felt at the time, Mike, from what I could tell, that maybe they thought she was going to be okay because she was so awake and so alert and giving them, having this conversation with them. Then all of a sudden it just stopped.
Yeah. She was alert to the point where she has a breathing tube down her throat, but she's able to scribble answers to the detective's questions.
Right.
And, in the end, they ask her point blank whether she thinks Carruth is responsible. She writes a question mark because I don't think she knows 100% for sure, but she had a very good feeling he was involved, again, from what she told the police officer in the ambulance and what she told the 911 operator. And based on what Cherica had to say and scribble down, he's the police's main suspect. Okay. From word one, he's the main suspect. He's going to have to be eliminated before they move on to anyone else. So basically now we're at the point where Cherica is in the hospital. Okay. She, like you said, falls into a coma, unfortunately, after being so strong to give the police all this info. And now Ray Carruth, during his initial interview with the police, they asked to see his cell phone. Okay. And they were able to see several calls that he made leading up to the shooting to the same number. And the use of cell phone triangulation is relatively new at this point. Okay. They could see that Ray wasn't miles away from the scene of the crime like he said he was, but rather that he was right near the scene of the crime, as Cherica had outlined.
Right.
Okay. The calls he was making was to an acquaintance named Michael Kennedy. The police then bring him in for questioning. And he says, he opens up right away and says that himself, a teenager named Stanley Abraham, and a guy named New York, who we would later find out is named Van Brett Watkins. All three of them were in a car. They drove alongside Cherica's car at the direction of Carruth and shot her.
Right. So she goes into a coma, and he gets out on bond at this point because nobody's died, so he's not facing any charges. But they told him, right, if either the baby or Cherica pass away, you're going to be facing first-degree murder charges, and we're going to have to bring you in. Well, a month later, almost a month later, she's been in a coma. She passes away on December 14th, 1999, and then Ray goes on the run.
He does. He goes on the run, right? So now, backtracking a little bit, we have that Van Brett Watkins, the guy known as New York, who was a very key part in this, all right? How they got to the point where they even arrested Ray was based on the statement of this Van Brett Watkins. And this is the most unique story of the whole crime to me, Ben, was they have this Van Brett Watkins, a hardened criminal. I mean, look this guy up. He has some serious stuff on his criminal record. He's at the police station. He's not giving them anything. They invite him out to like the police common area for a meal they had delivered, to give him a meal to eat while he was getting questioned. At the same time he's getting questioned, on the TV in front of him is Rae Carruth. And Rae Carruth gets asked at a press conference, hey, what do you think should happen to the people who shot Cherica? Rae Carruth says, I think they should get the death penalty. Well, at that point, Van Brett Watkins, hardened criminal, wasn't going to say anything, puts his fork down, tells the police officers, hey, I got some stuff to tell you. Let's go back in the interrogation room.
Wow.
And then he confesses to the crime.
That's crazy. I'd not read that. That's amazing.
He says he was the shooter, but everything was done at the direction of Carruth. Then at that point now we pick up to where you said, Ben. Then they go arrest him. He gets out on bond, like you mentioned. Then Cherica Adams dies, and now those charges get trumped up to first-degree murder, and he's on the run.
Yeah, so he convinced a beauty salon owner, Wendy Cole, who is going back to California, where she's from, for cosmetology school, and convinced her, hey, let me come along with you on the trip back. And it didn't take him long to track him down in Wildersville, Tennessee, which I had to look it up because I'm not familiar with Tennessee, even though I'm from Alabama, and I'm kind of got a pretty good geographical sense of where everything is. Wildersville is basically right off the interstate between Nashville and Memphis. So he was already onto the western half of Tennessee.
Yep, and they caught Ray. And this is a guy who thinks he's slick, setting up his girlfriend to be shot, putting her at risk, a baby at risk. And this guy is in a trunk of a car with a piss bottle when the police come and catch him. So real tough guy, Rae Carruth. That's how he gets caught.
Yeah, and I think I read where Carruth's mother actually informed the authorities where he was. So she's the one that kind of pointed them in the right direction. They tracked down Wendy Cole, and listen to one of the FBI investigators tell the story. She's sitting there, and he's saying, hey, you got to tell me where he is. I know you know where he is. And she's looking off to the side. He doesn't pick it up right away. But he notices after a minute that she keeps looking down at the keys, and then he realizes he's in the trunk.
Yeah, and you'll see this is a common theme with Rae Carruth. He may think he's a criminal mastermind, but everyone involved that he trusted throughout this process turns on him. Everyone flips on him. So he's not the criminal mastermind that he thinks. So at this point, he gets arrested. The trial takes place a year later. So the most notable parts of the trial are Cherica's 911 tapes that Ben mentioned before. They're played at trial, and they're very stirring and very, they're hard to listen to be honest, because you know what ended up happening to Cherica. Along with those tapes, Van Brett Watkins takes a deal, obviously, like I mentioned before, to flip on Carruth, and so does Michael Kennedy, who, remember, was the driver of the car. Kennedy confirms the theory that the police had, that Carruth felt like he was being squeezed for money, that Cherica would have wanted him to pay more child support when he was already paying child support for another kid that he had previously. That supposedly comes out as sort of being the motive here. Van Brett Watkins, again, a hardened criminal, admits very coldly on the stand to shooting Cherica and killing her. So even though he ended up flipping on Ray, he actually didn't really help the defense that much, because in the end, they convicted Ray of planning the murder, but they did not find him guilty of committing the murder. So the committing of the murder would have got him even more of a sentence, but they found him guilty of planning the murder, which landed him in jail for 18 years. Michael Kennedy got 10 and a half years for his role. The teenager, Abraham, who was in the car, 3 months in probation, and Van Brett Watkins got 20 to 30 years in jail.
And I'll tell you too, I saw some of that testimony. I don't know if you had a chance to see Watkins on the stand, Mike, but the jurors, and I'll point you also to the Charlotte Observer, has done a lot of great investigation into this case. They had a podcast out about the trial and the case itself. They've spoken to Ray. They showed up at his doorstep after he got out of prison, talked to him there. So they have a lot of great information, but they have a part of the documentary shows some of this testimony from Watkins. And I mean, the jurors even said, like, this is a guy that just scared you because he didn't care about anybody. You could tell that he was not afraid of anybody getting to him. He wasn't worried about anything that he did. You know, he even told the defense attorney, I don't need a weapon. I can rip you limb from limb if I wanted to. I mean, this is
that in court.
In
he
court.
said that on the witness stand.
Yes.
And another thing to remember, I saw an interview with Watkins a couple years after when he was in jail, and they asked him if he had any regrets. And he said, my only regret is not killing Rae Carruth.
Well, I think the other maybe speculation, I don't know if you saw any more about this, but, when Ray left the scene of the shooting, and we just kind of assumed that Ray left because he knew what had happened and he didn't want to be around to help her or whatever. But there was some speculation that he was actually scared that Watkins was actually going to kill him next, is why he left. I don't know if that's the case or what you've heard, but
that's pretty much consistently everywhere in everything I've read. Now, we're at the point where everyone's been sentenced, everyone's in jail. Now we have some aftermath here. Ray and Cherica's son, Chancellor Lee Adams, was born with brain damage. Now he is 20 years old. He has cerebral palsy, but he's defied all the odds. He's defied all the odds that and the obstacles that people said he'd be dealing with his whole life. He's learned to walk. He's learned to talk. He's done well in school. All this being raised by Cherica's mother, Sandra. It's just an incredible story of perseverance.
Yeah, I mean, as dark and as devastating as this story is, there is some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of, there is some positive that comes out of all this ultimately. As you mentioned, obviously Cherica's mom, really a saint, the way she's kind of raised and taken care of Chancellor. And I think she calls him Lee when you hear her talk about him. But, she also got a letter from Watkins while he was in jail when he actually reached out and said, sorry, I'm very sorry for what I did and all the pain that I caused you directly. And, I think she's forgiven him and forgiven everybody involved. And then Ray actually sent Lee Adams money in 2019 after he got out of jail. He sent money and they could never track down the return address. He had to send it through, I think, the corrections office. But it got to him. We don't know how much and it doesn't really matter. But Sandra said that she was thankful because she thinks it's actually a sign that maybe he has some remorse about what had happened along the way. So, there's some interesting things that have come out, over the years since.
Yeah, me and Ben can't say enough about Sandra Adams and the situation she was put in and how at every point where she could have reacted one way or another, everything I've read, she's been 100% classy, caring, and just a great person about everything. And has been great for Chancellor Lee. And, she's one of the shining stars of this story for sure, along with her grandson and, of course, Cherica. And like Ben mentioned, Carruth was released from jail in 2018 because, remember, he had to serve an 18-year sentence. He was released in 2018. I know he wrote a letter. He gave Chancellor Lee money, but I have in my notes, who cares? I mean, it's one of those things where this is like an unspeakable crime, a crime that I didn't know the specific details about until we looked into it. And like a lot of these a true crime sort of topics you look into, you almost can't believe what you're reading when you're researching it. Yeah,
they're always worse than you imagine, which is hard to believe, but it is true. And, when you really dig into a case and see all the details, it's, it can really it's very disturbing at many times and take your breath away at points. And I agree, Mike, for the most part, what he did was unspeakable. Maybe, and in all accounts, he was a perfect prisoner for what it's worth. So maybe he has found some remorse and maybe can do some good in his life. I think he's in Pennsylvania now. But I think more importantly for Chancellor Lee Adams, who's now about to graduate from high school. I guess that was all thrown off. I think I read a story actually very recently that he's doing some virtual learning. So I don't think he's finished up with school because of all of COVID, probably going back to school and trying to finish all that. His grandmother didn't want to send him back. Sandra didn't want to send him back into the classroom for obvious reasons and health risks. So he's still doing some virtual learning. But the organization has done a better job now of kind of being aware and recognizing this case, because obviously for the longest time they just kind of didn't want to have anything to do with it. But now they've kind of embraced Chancellor, and they took him to a trip. The fan group, support group there, actually flew him to London with Sandra for a Panthers game over there a year ago, and have brought him into the stadium once or twice too, I think, to honor him. So been pretty cool to see what's happened with his life, even though it started in unspeakable and unimaginable ways.
Absolutely, Ben. I couldn't agree more. We could have done a whole podcast episode just about how strong everyone else in this story, the whole Adams family, Cherica, Sandra, and Chancellor Lee were.
So that's Ray. Yeah, exactly. And are. So that's Rae Carruth. Thought we'd go back through and look at his case again and kind of give you, the main details of the story and how it all happened. But if you want to get more information, I would suggest visiting the Charlotte Observer. They've done a lot, as I mentioned, a long podcast, a very documented podcast. They have a documentary on their website. They actually had a reporter go and show up on his doorstep and speak with him directly after he got out of prison. So some really good stuff there if you really want to dive into it and learn more about what all had happened and what's going on now with that case. But we thought we'd touch on it now and go back almost 21 years ago in this upcoming November that will be the case. And that's crazy, man. Chancellor Lee Adams turns 21 this November. Pretty amazing that he's done as well as he has. And we hope for many more years. But hopefully you enjoyed this episode. If you like the true crime angle of sports, let us know. We'll do some more of this. We probably will as part of our minisodes. This one ran a little bit longer than we might normally do, but there's so much to these cases, and especially this one that we, there's still a lot we could have gotten into, but we scratched the surface, and I think we did a pretty good job of summing it all up, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, you can go so many different ways with these, but I think we touched on, the main points of it, and definitely a case I urge you to look further into if you're into true crime.
Absolutely. So thanks for listening to Distant Replay Podcast. This minisode is now a wrap, but I'll remind you can find us online at Distant Replay Podcast on Twitter, on Instagram, and on YouTube. Please subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast, and we'll talk to you again soon.